It was raining like a bucket. The weather in Gainesville seemed to match the mood of the crowd. Black umbrellas, black suits, black faces under the gray Texas sky. Detective Jamal Houston stood motionless, water running down his cheeks, mixing with the tears he wasn't even trying to hide. Sergeant Marcus Devlin wasn't just his mentor at the Gainesville PD. He was the one who'd gotten Jamal off the streets of Southside, turning a hopeless teenager into a respected detective. "He was the best of us," Captain Henderson said over the grave. 27 years of sterling service, integrity, honest, real. Jamal watched the coffin slowly sink into the rain-swept earth. He felt an emptiness inside the same emptiness that had appeared when Marcus had called him last Friday, gasping for breath from a heart attack. The ambulance hadn't made it in time. 57 years old. Too soon. The ceremony was coming to an end. People were beginning to disperse, shaking hands awkwardly, exchanging quiet words of condolence. Jamal remained standing at the grave. He needed a little more time. It was then that he noticed her. She stood a little farther away from the main group of mourners, a frail, dark-skinned girl much younger than most of those present. The rain soaked her simple black dress. Her hair stuck to her face, but she didn't seem to notice it. Her gaze was fixed on the lowering coffin, and tears streamed down her cheeks that she didn't even try to wipe away. Something in her grief hit Jamal. It seemed as deep and real as his own. He didn't remember seeing her before, and certainly Marcus had never mentioned such a young relative. The sergeant's widow, Grace, stood surrounded by their grown children, and none of them seemed to pay any attention to the lonely girl. When almost everyone had dispersed, she still remained where she was, now kneeling by the fresh grave, not caring about the dirt staining her clothes. Jamal approached her and asked quietly, "Are you all right?" She raised her head. Her eyes, full of unshed tears, met his. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding of their shared loss, an unspoken acknowledgement of the pain they both felt. He was... Her voice trembled. He was the only one who had ever... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Jamal understood. Marcus was that kind of person, the only one who ever really believed in you, helped you, saw things in you that you didn't see in yourself. "I know," he said simply, holding out his hand to help her up. "I'm Jamal Houston. I've been his partner for the last 5 years. Shatora," she replied quietly, accepting his hand. "Shatora Drakeford, Aya, his great niece on his mother's side." Her hand was cold and wet from the rain, but held tightly to his palm even as she was already on her feet. For a moment she held her gaze on their joined hands before reluctantly letting go. "I didn't know Marcus had relatives in Gainesville," Jamal said softly. "I just recently arrived," Shatora explained, tucking a wet strand of hair behind her ear. He was the only one I could turn to. And now..." A new wave of tears interrupted her. Jamal instinctively put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "The rain is getting heavier. I'll take you." He fell silent, realizing he didn't know where she was going. "Where are you staying?" Shatora lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed. I've been staying with Uncle Marcus for the past few days. But Grace, Mrs. Devlin, she said I needed to find another place. She doesn't want anyone in the house right now." "I understand." Jamal nodded. Grace was heartbroken. No wonder she wanted to be alone with the children. "Do you have a place to go? Friends in town?" Shatora shook her head, looking completely lost. "I thought maybe a motel." "With what money?" Jamal asked, noticing her tattered bag and worn shoes. She was silent, and that was answer enough. Jamal sighed. He heard Marcus's inner voice as clearly as if he were standing next to him. "If not you, then who, son? I didn't pull you out for you to walk past a man in trouble." "Look," he said, "we have a guest room. You can stay for a few days until you get your situation sorted out." Her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Really? You don't even know me." "You're Marcus's family," Jamal replied simply. That was enough. As they got into the car, Shatora looked back at the grave, and Jamal noticed a strange expression in her eyes, something like satisfaction, but it disappeared so quickly that he thought he had imagined it. On the way home, Shatora told her story. She spoke softly, looking out the window at the streets of Gainesville whizzing by, and her voice sounded monotonous, as if she were repeating a well-rehearsed text. She was from Houston. Her mother had died of an overdose when she was 14. Stepfather. She didn't want to talk about her stepfather in detail, but Jamal, who'd been on the force for 10 years, could fill in the blanks. The bruises that never healed, the screaming at night, the constant fear. She'd run away at 18, living wherever she could, scraping by on odd jobs. When things got dire, she remembered a distant relative, a policeman in Gainesville whom her mother sometimes mentioned with respect. He offered to help right away, Chatora said with a sad smile. He didn't even hesitate. He said, "Come over, we'll figure it out." I had just arrived only 5 days ago. And then, Jamal nodded. And then the heart attack. Sudden, unforeseen. Life can be cruel sometimes. He looked at the girl's profile, illuminated by the streetlights whizzing by. Something in her story didn't add up, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. A professional habit of questioning every detail, nothing more. The girl had just lost the only person who could help her. What reason did he have not to believe her? "We're here," he said, turning into the driveway of a modest 2-story house in a quiet Gainesville neighborhood. Jamal's house wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy, the result of 10 years of saving for a cop's salary. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard with a grill, a 2-car garage. He'd bought it 3 years ago, right after he'd married Kayla, with a future family in mind. The front door opened before they even got out of the car. Standing on the doorstep was Kayla, a slender woman with short dreadlocks and penetrating eyes. She held a large umbrella over her head, ready to greet her husband. "Jamal, I was beginning to worry. You haven't been answering your phone and—" She stopped talking when she noticed Shatora coming out of the passenger door. "Oh, you're not alone." "This is Shatora Drakeford, Marcus's niece," Jamal explained, quickly escorting both women into the house, away from the rain. She was in a difficult situation. I offered to let her stay with us for a few days. Kayla looked at the girl carefully, wet, shivering, her eyes red with tears. She looked like the epitome of misery. "Of course," she said after a pause that was a little longer than politeness demanded. "I'm very sorry about your uncle, Shatora. Sergeant Devlin was a wonderful man." "Thank you," Shatora replied quietly, lowering her eyes. "I don't want to cause any inconvenience." "No inconvenience," Jamal said firmly. "Marcus would do the same for any of my relatives." Kayla led Shatora upstairs to the guest bedroom, gave her a towel and offered her a shower while she found dry clothes. Jamal stayed downstairs, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. It had been a rough day, and he had a feeling the conversation with his wife was going to be difficult. When Kayla came downstairs, her face was calm, but he knew his wife well enough to see the tension in the corners of her lips. "Marcus's niece?" she asked quietly, taking a seat beside him. He'd never mentioned her. "A distant relative on her mother's side," Jamal said. "I'm surprised too, I admit. But she was in a difficult situation and I couldn't just—" "I understand," Kayla interrupted him, putting her hand on his palm. "You did the right thing, but Jamal, we don't know anything about her. Maybe we should—" "I'll check her story tomorrow," he assured her. "Just in case. But today, I just couldn't leave her out there in the rain by Marcus's grave." Kayla nodded, squeezing his hand. "Good. A few days is fine, as long as she finds a job or... Did she have some kind of plan?" "We haven't discussed the details," Jamal admitted. She was too upset. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Shatora was coming down, dressed in Kayla's borrowed pajamas, which were a little big for her. With clean hair and no smeared mascara, she looked even younger, almost a teenager. I wanted to say thank you," she said, stopping in the doorway to the living room. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done." "Don't think about it," Kayla said, standing up. "You must be hungry. I'll heat up dinner." While they ate, Jamal's parents, Leroy and Vernita, stopped by to offer their condolences. They were unable to attend the funeral because of Leroy's medical procedure, and Jamal was happy to see them, even on this sad day. Vernita, an energetic woman with graying hair gathered into a tight bundle, noticed Shatora immediately. "And who is this?" she asked bluntly, as she always did. After a brief explanation, Vernita frowned. "Marcus never mentioned a niece," she said, looking at the girl carefully. "And I've known Grace for years. It's a very distant bloodline," Chatora explained quietly. "Through my mother. They weren't close." Vernita continued to stare at her, as if trying to see something behind the modest facade. Chatora endured the gaze with unexpected calmness for someone in such a vulnerable situation. "All right," Vernita said at last. "If Jamal says you can stay, then so be it." The visit was short. Leroy looked tired after his procedure, and soon the elderly couple left, promising to come back tomorrow. In parting, Vernita looked at Chatora once more with a long, appraising gaze. At night, lying in her new bed in the Houston house, Chatora looked up at the ceiling and smiled. What had happened in the cemetery was something new, something she had never experienced before. Uncle Marcus was indeed a relative of hers, albeit a distant one. She had come to him in desperation, running away from domestic violence, and he had truly taken her in, just as she had told him. His sudden death should have been a disaster. She was alone again, unsupported, without a roof over her head. But then she met Jamal, and something happened, special. She remembered the moment in the cemetery when their eyes had met, when he had seen her tears and responded to her pain. It had been like a revelation, a pure, unclouded connection through shared grief. She closed her eyes, reliving that moment again, feeling warmth spill through her body at the memory of his gaze, full of compassion and understanding. No one had ever looked at her like that, like she was real, like her feelings mattered. At that moment in the cemetery, something clicked in her mind. Something flipped. Something changed. They were connected, truly connected. And that connection came through grief. Chatora turned on her side, hugging her pillow. Thoughts began to form in her mind that had never occurred to her before. If such a strong, such a true bond is only possible through shared grief, what would happen if more grief was created? Would the bond become even stronger? The thought should have terrified her, but instead it seemed logical, perfectly logical. She thought of Jamal's family, about his wife Kayla and her wary gaze, about his mother Vernita, who clearly didn't trust her, his father Leroy, his sister Tamika, and her husband Edric. They were all part of Jamal's life. They all received his attention, his care. What if they had, disappeared? What if she could create a new grief for him, even deeper than what they shared today? Wouldn't that have made their bond even stronger? Strangely, these thoughts didn't seem horrible or frightening to her. They seemed right, natural, like she'd finally found the key to how relationships between people worked. Chatora fell asleep with a smile, anticipating the moment when they would be bound together again by their shared grief, a greater grief. After all, the stronger the grief, the deeper the bond. For Chatora, it was the only logic that made sense. 3 weeks had passed since Sergeant Devlin's funeral. Life in the Houston home had taken a new direction, one that somehow found a place for Chatora. The temporary shelter was slowly becoming permanent, though no one discussed it openly. Chatora helped with household chores, cooking simple meals she had learned from her mother. Kayla helped her put together her resume and even arranged an interview at the cafe where her friend worked. Jamal went back to work, now with a new partner, a young officer named Ray Tyson, who clearly lacked Marcus's experience. That Sunday morning, Chatora stood at the guest bedroom window, watching Jamal wash his car in the driveway. He was laughing, talking to a neighbor over the fence, and there was no trace in his laughter of the pain she'd seen in the cemetery 3 weeks ago. Something clenched inside her, something cold and heavy. The grief was going away. It always goes away, she knew that. But with it went that special connection, that moment of pure contact she'd experienced with Jamal. Now he was just a kind man again, someone who had helped her in her time of need. But there was no longer that depth between them, that understanding, that intimacy. Chatora pressed her palm against the glass. She should have seen this coming. Grief doesn't last forever. It dulls, transforms, loses its sharpness, and with it the bond born in its depths weakened. If she wanted to feel that unity again, that special bond, she needed a new grief, fresh, deeper. The thought didn't cause her to recoil. On the contrary, it seemed natural, even inevitable, as if it was the only logical conclusion to everything she had experienced. That same day, Vernita and Leroy Houston were scheduled for their usual Sunday family reunion. Chattore prepared for their arrival with the utmost care. She made a sweet potato pie from a recipe she found in one of Kayla's cookbooks. The pie turned out beautifully with a crispy caramel crust. "It looks delicious," Kayla nodded approvingly as she looked into the kitchen. "You're full of surprises, Chatora. I want to thank you for your hospitality," she said with a genuine smile. "You have done so much for me." When Jamal's parents arrived, the pie took its place of honor on the table. Vernita, always wary of Chatora, seemed less suspicious this time. "Did you make this yourself?" she asked, looking at the dessert. "Yes, Mrs. Houston. I hope you like it." At lunch, they talked about Jamal's work, about how Leroy was gradually recovering from surgery, about Chatora's new job at the cafe. Jamal was relaxed, laughing at his father's jokes, holding Kayla's hand. There was no shadow of the deep grief in his eyes that had so attracted Chatora. "And now for dessert," Kayla announced when the main course was eaten. Chatora helped put the pie on the plates. Everyone but herself. She explained that she didn't like sweets. No one noticed her watching Vernita closely as she took the first bite. "Very tasty," Vernita praised, to everyone's surprise. "What is that spice? Nutmeg? A family secret?" Chatora smiled. A secret indeed it was, but not a family secret. To Vernita's portion, she added a special mixture that she had prepared herself from herbs and chemicals she had bought at various places in the city over the past 2 weeks. The mixture wasn't meant to kill immediately. It was designed to have a gradual effect, mimicking the symptoms of heart failure. Vernita finished the entire piece. The first symptoms appeared 3 days later. Vernita called Jamal, complaining of weakness and shortness of breath. By evening, she got worse and Leroy took her to the hospital. "It looks like heart failure," the doctor said after the first tests. But strangely, she had never had heart problems before. Chatora went with Jamal to the hospital every day. She stayed close by, quiet and caring, ready to support at any moment. She watched the worry slowly turn to fear, the shadow of the pain she longed to see again in his eyes. Vernita held on for almost a week. The doctors were baffled. All the vitals were steadily worsening despite the treatment. No one could understand why a healthy woman suddenly began to fade away so rapidly. On the penultimate day, Vernita suddenly regained consciousness after hours of forgetfulness. She looked at Chatora, standing by her bedside with Jamal, and something flashed in her eyes: recognition, understanding, horror. Vernita began, but then she coughed, choking. "Mom, don't strain yourself." Jamal took her hand. "The doctors say you need to conserve your strength." Vernita shifted her gaze to her son, then back to Chatora. Their eyes met for a second, and Chatora felt a strange satisfaction. Vernita knew. Somehow she had realized what was happening, but it was too late. "Son, be careful," was all Vernita could whisper before she lost consciousness again. She died that same night, quietly, in her sleep, as the doctors had said. Chatora stood beside Jamal as he was told the news. She saw his face contorted in pain, his strong body bent as if from a physical blow. She put her hand on his shoulder and he turned to her, looking for support. At that moment, she saw that look again, the same one from the cemetery, the look of a man crushed by grief, searching for connection, for understanding, for something to hold on to as the world crumbled. Their eyes met, and she felt it, the same pure, unclouded connection. It was as if an invisible thread stretched between them, created out of shared pain. Chatora felt a warmth spread through her body. It was almost like love, but deeper, stronger, real. The funeral was 3 days later. The whole neighborhood came to say goodbye to Vernita. She was known for her community service and helping her neighbors. Jamal stood by the coffin, pale and devastated. 2 losses in such a short time. It was too much even for such a strong man. Chatora never took a step away from him. Kayla was there for him, of course, but she was too consumed with her own grief and caring for the inconsolable Leroy to give Jamal what he needed. And Chatora could. She understood his pain because she had created it herself. She knew what he needed because she needed it herself. After the funeral, Jamal sat in his office, staring into the void. Shatora brought him tea. "I don't know how to cope with all this," he said quietly. "First Marcus, now Mom." "You will," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "I'm here for you. I understand how you feel." He looked at her with that special look she longed to see. "Yes," he said. "You understand. You've lost loved ones too." But time passed, and as she had expected, the sharpness of the grief began to dull. Jamal was coming back to life. Work demanded his attention. Kayla needed his support. Leroy, broken by the loss of his wife, called often at night. And Shatora felt the bond created by grief begin to weaken again. This was unacceptable. She had to act faster this time. While the first grief still lingered, a new one had to be created. The choice fell to Tamika and Edric. Jamal's sister and her husband lived in a neighboring town about an hour away. They often came up on weekends, especially now after Vernita's death, to support Jamal and Leroy. The plan matured quickly. Shatora knew that every Friday, Tamika and Edric drove to Dallas for a date, a tradition they'd maintained since college. They always took the same road back, late at night when traffic was minimal. Perfect timing for an accident. Ciatora had made careful preparations. She borrowed a car from a colleague at the cafe, saying she needed to go to a distant relative's house. She wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, parked on the side of the road in a strategic place, a sharp turn, poor visibility, a fence which will not withstand a strong impact, and waited. Tamika and Edric were punctual as always. Their silver Honda appeared on the road at exactly 11:45. Chatora waited for the perfect moment, then swerved into the road, right in front of their car, blinding them with her high beams. Edric, trying to avoid a collision, twisted the steering wheel sharply. Shatora saw in her rearview mirror as their car smashed through the guardrail and flew down the steep slope. She didn't stay to watch the aftermath. There was no need to. No one could survive a fall like that. She got the car back before dawn and no one suspected a thing. The call came early in the morning. Jamal answered, still sleepy. Shatora watched his face change as he listened to the news, how the life was leaving his eyes again, replaced by that empty, desperate look she loved so much. Tamika and Edric. He couldn't finish the sentence. The phone fell out of his hand. The accident. They both... Kayla cried out, rushing to him. They embraced, clinging to each other like drowning people. Shatora stood back, watching. Something unpleasant moved inside her at the sight of their embrace. Something akin to jealousy? But that was absurd. She didn't want Jamal in the normal sense. She wanted their bond through grief, nothing more than that. And yet, when he turned to her, holding out his hand, inviting her into their circle of grief, she felt triumph. She was part of this. She had created this. It was her work, her creation. 2 losses in such a short time had broken Jamal. He took a leave of absence from work. He sat in his office for hours, staring at nothing. Sometimes he drank. Not too much, but enough to dull the pain. Kayla did her best to support her husband and father-in-law, but she was exhausted from grief herself. She loved Tamika too. They had been close friends even before her marriage to Jamal. Shatora had never been as close to Jamal as she was in these days after the second tragedy. He sought her company, her understanding. She knew how to listen without interrupting, without offering trivial consolations. She was just there, sharing his pain, which she herself had created. It was perfect, almost. But then she began to notice something she hadn't foreseen. Jamal and Kayla, instead of drifting apart under the weight of grief, instead drew closer together. Their shared loss created a new depth of understanding between them. They often talked at night when they thought Shatora was asleep, holding hands tighter than before, seeking comfort in each other. After Tamika and Edric's funerals, Jamal withdrew even more. In the evenings, he would sit in his office, drinking whiskey and looking at pictures of his sister. On one such night, Shatora brought him tea. "You need sleep," she said quietly, setting the cup on the table. Jamal looked up at her, his eyes red, swollen with tears and sleep. the same look that made her insides clench with a strange, twisted pleasure. "I can't," he answered hoarsely. "Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Mom's, Tamika's, Edric's, even Marcus. Everyone I've lost." Shatora knelt beside his chair, took his hand in hers. "I understand," she whispered. "I see your pain, Jamal. I can feel it." She did feel it. His grief was almost palpable, filling the room, enveloping them both. Shatora could feel the excitement growing inside her. Dark, wrong, but so strong she could barely breathe. Jamal looked at her gratefully, unaware of the storm raging in her body. "Thank you for being there for me," he said. "I don't know how I would have done it without you." Shatora rose slowly, still holding his hand, and sat down on the arm of the chair. Her body was so close to his that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "You're not alone," she whispered, leaning closer. "I'm here, I'll always be here." She touched his face, wiping a tear from his cheek. Her fingers lingered on his skin. Confusion flashed in his eyes, but he was too heartbroken to resist human warmth. When she leaned in and kissed him, he didn't pull away immediately. For a moment, his lips answered the kiss, hot, salty with tears. Shatora felt a wave of ecstasy pass through her entire body. But then Jamal pulled away abruptly, as if awakening from a trance. "Shatora, no," he said, rising from his chair. "Yeah, I can't. I have Kayla. This isn't right." Shatora remained seated, her face a mask of humility and understanding, but rage raged inside. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to help. I'll go." Later that night, locked in her room, Shatora lay in the dark, reliving again and again the moment she'd seen the pure, unclouded grief in Jamal's eyes. Her hand slid under the blanket, between her legs, finding the damp warmth. She masturbated, remembering his tears, his trembling voice, his pain that she had created herself. The orgasm was so intense, she had to bite down on the pillow to keep from screaming. Afterward, she lay staring at the ceiling and thought about Kyle, about how Jamal had returned to their shared bedroom every night, how they found comfort in each other, holding hands, whispering, how Kayla took up space that should have belonged to her, to Shatora. It was unacceptable. She could hear them that night, the muffled moans, the creaking of the bed. They'd had sex, clinging to each other like drowning men. Shatora pressed her ear against the wall, listening to the sounds of their intimacy, and a black, all-consuming jealousy grew inside her. They were misusing grief, desecrating it with their animal passion. Grief should have connected Jamal to her, not Kayla. Shatora clenched her fist so hard her nails dug into her palms. Kayla had to disappear. Only then would Jamal be completely broken. Only then would his grief reach such depths that the bond between them would become unbreakable. And then, at his moment of greatest vulnerability, she would finally get what she needed: absolute unity through absolute grief. Kayla's death wasn't quick. Shatora had made sure of that. Every day she added a tiny dose of arsenic to the woman's morning coffee, savoring the slow fading of her rival. At first it was minor symptoms: headaches, nausea, weakness. Kayla wrote it all off as stress and grief. By the time the more serious signs of poisoning appeared, it was too late. The doctors were baffled. A young, healthy woman was dying before their eyes for no apparent reason. Blood tests revealed nothing definitive. Poisons administered in small doses are difficult to resist. Jamal never left his wife's bedside. Shatora was by his side, patient and caring, ready to support him at any moment. She brought him food that he hardly ate, fresh clothes that he changed mechanically without noticing. She watched the last spark of life leave Kayla's eyes and felt a deep, twisted satisfaction. On the last day, Kayla regained consciousness. Her gaze focused on Shatora standing at the foot of the bed, and understanding flashed in it. "It's you," she whispered with parched lips. "What, darling?" Jamal leaned toward her, unable to hear. But Kayla could no longer answer. Her eyes closed, her breathing became intermittent. An hour later, she left. It rained on the day of the funeral, just as it had rained the day Shatora had first met Jamal at Marcus's grave. She found a special symbolism in it. The circle was closing. Jamal was a shadow of himself. 4 losses in such a short time. Marcus, his mother, his sister, and her husband, now his wife. Too many for one man. He moved like an automaton, spoke rarely and quietly. His eyes were empty and lifeless. Shatora was triumphant. He belonged only to her now. Now he was completely dependent on her, emotionally, physically, in every sense. Now their bond, born in grief, was unbreakable. She moved into his bedroom a week after the funeral. He didn't mind. He didn't react to much at all in those days. Shatora held him at night when he woke from nightmares, wiped away his tears, whispered comfort. "I am here," she would say. "I will always be here." He clung to her like a drowning man to a straw, the only thing left in his shattered world. But what Shatora hadn't foreseen was Leroy Houston's stubbornness. Jamal's father, despite his own grief for his wife, daughter, and daughter-in-law, had not lost his ability to observe and analyze, and what he saw he did not like. At first, it was only a vague doubt. It was a strange coincidence that a young woman shows up at Marcus's funeral, and soon a chain of tragedies around Jamal begins. Leroy started digging. The first thing he did was call Grace Devlin, Marcus's widow. "Grace, I'm sorry to bother you, but Shatora Drakeford. Did Marcus ever mention her? She says she's his niece." "Never," Grace replied after a pause. "Marcus never had a niece by that name. Who is she?" This conversation caused Leroy to dig deeper. He reached out to an old friend of his at the Houston Police Department, asking him to look into information about Shatora Drakeford. The answer came back 3 days later. "Shatora Drakeford exists," the friend said over the phone. 22 years old, born in Houston. Mother died of an overdose, just like she said. But here's the interesting thing. Shatora's been in trouble with the law. Nothing serious, mostly petty theft. And then there's this. Her ex-boyfriend died under strange circumstances. Officially an accident, but the detective on the case was suspicious. Not enough evidence to convict. Leroy listened, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Thanks, Mike. There's something else I need to check out." That same day, he met with Ray Tyson, Jamal's new partner. The young officer was concerned about his older colleague. "He's like a zombie, Mr. Houston. I've never seen a man so disconnected from life." "Ray, I need your help," Leroy said. "I think there's something wrong with this girl, Shatora. She came out of nowhere, and now she has complete control over my son's life." Ray frowned. "What do you want me to do?" "Check her story. She claims to be Marcus Devlin's niece, but his wife says that's not true. Also, look at the circumstances of all the recent deaths. My wife never had a heart problem. Tamika and Edric were careful drivers. And Kayla, a young, healthy woman, doesn't just die." Ray looked at the old man questioningly. "Mr. Houston, do you realize what you're suggesting? These are very serious allegations." "I understand," Leroy nodded, "but 4 deaths in 2 months. It's too much even for the most unfortunate coincidence." Ray started by checking out the story about the old partner. Shatora had claimed that Marcus Devlin had been her mother's partner years ago. But Marcus's personnel file made no mention of service in Houston. His entire career had been spent in Gainesville. Then Ray took on the car accident that killed Tamika and Edric. The report was standard. Loss of control on a sharp curve, car smashed through a guardrail. But a witness, driving by minutes before the accident, mentioned a strange car parked on the side of the road. No one paid much attention to it at the time. Ray found that witness, an elderly trucker. "Yes, the car was oddly parked," he confirmed. "The headlights were off, although someone was clearly sitting inside. I was thinking maybe a couple alone or some junkies. Nobody usually stops there. It's a dangerous corner." "Can you describe the car?" "Dark sedan, maybe blue or black. Older model." I caught a glimpse. Not enough to convict, but enough to raise suspicion. The hardest part was Kayla's death. No obvious signs of violent death. Doctors diagnosed multi-organ failure but couldn't determine the cause. Ray asked the expert to look at the autopsy results. "There's something wrong here," the expert said after reviewing the documents. "There are signs pointing to heavy metal poisoning, but the tox screens were negative. Maybe they were looking for the wrong toxins?" "It's possible. Some poisons are very hard to detect, especially if the poisoning was chronic, low dose." Ray gathered all the information and came to Leroy. The old man listened to him with grim satisfaction. "I knew," he said. "I felt that something was wrong here. Mr. Houston, we still don't have enough evidence to convict. It's all circumstantial evidence and coincidence. I need to talk to Jamal, Leroy said firmly. He needs to know. Be careful, Ray warned. If you're right, this woman is dangerous. Leroy did not heed the advice. The next day, he arrived at his son's house. Shatora opened the door, her face a mask of concern and compassion. Leroy, how good of you to come. Jamal will be glad to see you. I doubt it, Leroy replied coldly as he walked past her into the house. I need to talk to my son, alone. Shatora tensed slightly but nodded with an understanding smile. Of course, he's in the study. I'll make tea. Jamal sat at his desk, mindlessly thumbing through papers. He looked up when his father entered, but there was no recognition in his gaze. Son, Leroy stepped closer, put his hand on Jamal's shoulder. We need to talk about Shatora. The name seemed to pierce a hole in Jamal's apathy. He blinked, focusing his eyes on his father. What about her? She's not who she says she is, Leroy said quietly. She was never Marcus's niece. Grace confirmed it, and I think... He took a deep breath. I think she has something to do with the deaths in our family. Jamal looked at his father with incomprehension. What are you saying? I'm saying that this woman could be the cause of death of your mother, your sister, and your wife, Leroy said stiffly. Ray helped me gather information. Too many coincidences, son. Too many deaths since she showed up. Jamal shook his head slowly. No, that's not possible. Shatora has been there for me the whole time. She's the only one who stood by me. Ray frowned. What do you want me to do? Check her story. She claims to be Marcus Devlin's niece, but his wife says that's not true. Also, look at the circumstances of all the recent deaths. My wife never had a heart problem. Tamika and Edric were careful drivers. And Kayla. A young, healthy woman doesn't just die. Ray looked at the old man questioningly. Mr. Houston, do you realize what you're suggesting? These are very serious allegations. I understand, Leroy nodded, but 4 deaths in 2 months. It's too much even for the most unfortunate coincidence. Ray started by checking out the story about the old partner. Shatora had claimed that Marcus Devlin had been her mother's partner years ago, but Marcus's personnel file made no mention of service in Houston. His entire career had been spent in Gainesville. Then Ray took on the car accident that killed Tamika and Edric. The report was standard. Loss of control on a sharp curve. Car smashed through a guardrail. But a witness, driving by minutes before the accident, mentioned a strange car parked on the side of the road. No one paid much attention to it at the time. Ray found that witness, an elderly trucker. Yes, the car was oddly parked, he confirmed. The headlights were off, although someone was clearly sitting inside. I was thinking maybe a couple alone or some junkies. Nobody usually stops there. It's a dangerous corner. Can you describe the car? Dark sedan, maybe blue or black, older model. I caught a glimpse. Not enough to convict, but enough to raise suspicion. The hardest part was Kayla's death. No obvious signs of violent death. Doctors diagnosed multi-organ failure, but couldn't determine the cause. Ray asked the expert to look at the autopsy results. There's something wrong here, the expert said after reviewing the documents. There are signs pointing to heavy metal poisoning, but the tox screens were negative. Maybe they were looking for the wrong toxins? It's possible. Some poisons are very hard to detect, especially if the poisoning was chronic, low dose. Ray gathered all the information and came to Leroy. The old man listened to him with grim satisfaction. I knew, he said. I felt that something was wrong here. Mr. Houston, we still don't have enough evidence to convict. It's all circumstantial evidence and coincidences. I need to talk to Jamal, Leroy said firmly. He needs to know. Be careful, Ray warned. If you're right, this woman is dangerous. Leroy did not heed the advice. The next day, he arrived at his son's house. Shatora opened the door, her face a mask of concern and compassion. Leroy, how good of you to come. Jamal will be glad to see you. I doubt it, Leroy replied coldly as he walked past her into the house. I need to talk to my son, alone. Shatora tensed slightly, but nodded with an understanding smile. Of course, he's in the study. I'll make tea. Jamal sat at his desk, mindlessly thumbing through papers. He looked up when his father entered, but there was no recognition in his gaze. Son, Leroy stepped closer, put his hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We need to talk. About Shatora." The name seemed to pierce a hole in Jamal's apathy. He blinked, focusing his eyes on his father. "What about her?" "She's not who she says she is," Leroy said quietly. "She was never Marcus's niece." Grace confirmed it. "And I think—" He took a deep breath. "I think she has something to do with the deaths in our family." Jamal looked at his father with incomprehension. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this woman could be the cause of death of your mother, your sister, and your wife," Leroy said stiffly. "Ray helped me gather information. Too many coincidences, son. Too many deaths since she showed up." Jamal shook his head slowly. "No, that's not possible. Shatora has been there for me the whole time. She's the only one who stood by me." "Because she's manipulating you!" Leroy raised his voice. "She creates an addiction. First, she destroys everyone you care about, and then she becomes the only person you can lean on." Jamal looked at his father with growing horror. "I can't believe this. Why would she do that?" "I don't know," Leroy admitted. "But we have to stop her before she does more damage." What neither Leroy nor Jamal knew was that Shatora was standing outside the door, listening to every word. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms until they bled. Leroy was becoming a problem, a serious problem. Shatora backed away from the door, her thoughts racing frantically. Leroy had to disappear. But how? Another natural death would raise too many suspicions. An accident? Also risky, especially if Ray was already digging in that direction. Either way, she had to act fast. Leroy left after an hour, having gotten no reaction from his son other than denial and apathy. Shatora walked him to the door with a caring smile, but there was cold determination in her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Leroy," she said in parting. "At your age, you have to be especially careful." That night, when Jamal finally fell asleep, Shatora slipped out of the house. She took his gun from the safe, the code to which he had once carelessly named in front of her. It was risky, using a cop's gun to kill, but there was a special symbolism to it that appealed to her. Ending the cycle with Jamal's weapon, killing the last person close to him, perfect. Leroy lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. After Vernita's death, he was all alone. Shatora knew his routine. Early bedtime, TV always on for background noise. She parked a block away and walked the rest of the way. The neighbors paid no attention to the dark figure slipping between the houses. Shatora went to the back door knowing that Leroy often forgot to lock it. Indeed, the door was unlocked. She entered quietly, listening. The television was on in the living room, but Leroy himself was not there. Shatora moved on toward the bedroom. The bedroom door was ajar. The faint light of the nightlight fell on the bed, where the figure of a sleeping man was visible under a thin blanket. Shatora raised her pistol, took aim, and at that moment the light flashed. "Put the gun down, Shatora," came Ray Tyson's voice. He stood in the corner of the room, his own gun pointed at her. "Slowly, to the floor." Shatora froze, not lowering her weapon. Her eyes darted to the bed where only a pile of pillows lay instead of Leroy. "Where is he?" she asked with surprising calm. "Someplace safe," Ray answered. "Put the gun down, Shatora." "Now." "No," she said simply. "I'm not finished." She turned sharply, pointing the gun at Ray. The shot rang out, but not from her weapon. Jamal stood in the doorway, his gun still raised. A look of horror and disbelief froze on his face. Shatora fell to her knees, blood spilling over her white blouse. She looked at Jamal with genuine bewilderment. "Why?" she whispered. "I was doing this for us, for our bond." Jamal stepped toward her, his face contorted with pain and anger. "What bond? What are you talking about?" "Grief," Shatora said with difficulty, blood beginning to bubble on her lips. "It is only through grief that we truly connect. I saw it in your eyes at the cemetery. You were so real, so open. I wanted more. I wanted you all to be mine." Jamal stared at her with growing horror, realizing the full extent of her madness. "You killed them all, so we couldn't connect through grief?" "Yes," Shatora smiled with faint lips. "And it worked. Every time you lost someone, you grew closer to me. It was perfect. Perfect." Her gaze began to glass over, but she was still smiling. I felt you, Jamal. Really felt you. No one had ever... She didn't finish the sentence. Her eyes closed, her body went limp. Ray called an ambulance, but it was too late. Shatora Drakeford was dead before the paramedics arrived. Leroy came out of the next room, where he had been hiding during the whole incident. He hugged his son silently. Jamal was trembling, tears streaming down his face. It's my fault, he whispered. I brought her to our house. I didn't see... No one would have seen, Leroy said quietly. No one could have guessed such a thing. In the days that followed, the whole truth came out. Toxicology tests confirmed the presence of arsenic in Kayla's body. In Shatora's personal belongings, they found a diary where she described in minute detail her acts of love, as she called them. The poisoning of Vernita, the staged accident for Tamika and Edric, the slow murder of Kayla. It was all part of her twisted plan to create a real connection with Jamal through grief. A month later, sitting on the veranda of Leroy's house, Jamal was still trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't understand, he said. How can a person be so broken, so distorted? Leroy shook his head. I don't think we'll ever understand, son. Some things are beyond normal human understanding. Shatora saw the world differently than we do. For her, pain and grief were ways of connecting, not separating. She called it love, Jamal said quietly. In her journal, she thought she loved me. It wasn't love, Leroy said firmly. It was something else, something we don't even have a name for. They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the horizon. A long road of healing lay before them, but they would begin it together, supporting each other through grief. Real grief, not artificially created grief, but the kind that comes when you love and lose. Marcus once told me, Jamal said slowly, that the scariest thing about our work is not the killers who know they are doing evil. The worst are the ones who truly believe they're doing good. Leroy nodded, looking at the first stars appearing in the evening sky. He was right, your Marcus. He was always right.